All right, so today we're here with Dr. Joye Henrie. Dr. Joye, welcome to the Sauce of Life podcast. This podcast is about people that convert their life's experiences into ingredients that they use to feed others. It's truly about learning how you became the person that you have become now and where you're headed. And with that, though, I will allow you to introduce yourself. So please.
Absolutely. I always find the question about introducing myself to be interesting because I feel like the answer to that depends on where I am. I gave briefings while I was in the Air Force about that very issue. So, one introduction would go like this. I am a poor kid from Little Rock, Arkansas. I was the first grader who had lice. I was the poorest kid in a poor neighborhood because anybody who grows up poor knows that there are levels of poor. I was a teen mom. I was a high school dropout. I was in state custody at 15 years old and living in a foster home. So all of those things are part of who I am, including, a history of a family where my dad was a felon and he had an 8th grade education and my grandmother had a 5th grade education. So there's one introduction. The other introduction is I have a doctorate in clinical psychology. I'm a clinical psychologist and an Air Force veteran. I served as an officer in the United States Air Force. I became a foster parent and was a level 3 foster parent for special needs kids. Have served as a president of booster clubs and all kinds of other community service roles. And currently I'm a business owner. So you can hear how disjointed those two introductions sound, but all of it's true.
Interesting. I wouldn't think that it's disjointed given the life that I've lived. It's very interesting, though. It seems that we come from some similar backgrounds as far as trauma. Myself having endured all of the original 10 ACEs and multiples, and then on the extended scale, having endured most of those as well. But being able now to have that second introduction, how does that feel for you that you've now seemingly taken charge of your life and essentially stood on all of your traumas as the foundation for launching who you are today?
Well, it's interesting because it was quite a journey to even get to that place, which we'll perhaps talk about in a bit. But you try to go into life making yourself fit in different places. And that's exercise in futility in my experience. And ultimately, you have to learn to carve out spaces for yourself where all of you can fit. Because if you only take part of yourself to a space, inevitably you're going to feel incomplete, disjointed, and other. So other has been a big theme in my life. So I had to get to a place where I decided that I was going to accept myself rather than waiting for other people to accept me. And part of self-acceptance is being able to unflinchingly say who you are and where you're from. So it's definitely shaped who I am and how I got here. But as you probably know yourself with your own journey, it's not necessarily all that pretty behind the scenes.
No, it's not. And it's a lot of work. And I could be wrong, but I feel like it's going to be a lifetime of work. Even being as successful as I am now, as content with life as I am now, I understand that I am continually on a journey of self-improvement and self-discovery. What was it, do you feel, that led you to not become a victim of your life and your upbringing, but instead become a victor of it? And is there a specific timeline that you had set for yourself as it relates to that?
Ooh, interesting question. I attribute not becoming just, a raw statistic to a number of things. And if we look at the literature around like risk and protective factors in children, there's all of that stuff we can account for, some of which is just luck, the disposition that we're born with, the intelligence we have, the talents we have, or extracurricular opportunities, or a whole bunch of things like that can influence us. I would say dispositionally, though, I tend to be an optimistic person, a problem solver, somebody who sees the glass as half full, but not in an unrealistic way, in a this can't be the final answer kind of way. And that's always propelled me to keep pushing. And it's fueled a lot of hope and idealism in me, which I've found across time, a lot of people want to shoot that down and they want to say, oh, you're idealistic, as if that's a bad thing. And that was one of those things that eventually I had to learn to take back myself and go, wait a second. If I look at what helped me survive, hope and idealism were central to that. You know, without hope for something, then what's the point and how do we survive? And so I had to reclaim that as my own and be unapologetic for it. Um, there were a whole bunch of other ingredients too, though, because in my sibling group, I had three brothers, and I was the caretaker. I was the parentified child who protected my brothers and took care of them, made sure their needs were met, and that sort of thing. And I think that trained me to not only believe in my capabilities, but to go out into the world with a problem-solving mindset. And then also, one thing that a lot of people I have found don't necessarily like to hear is luck. There were certain things that I just got lucky on where I saw that my peers who were facing some of the same statistics did not have certain aspects of luck that I had. And I say that because I think that it warrants not only some empathy for some of the folks who don't end up where we are, but also some humility for ourselves and understanding that there are many forces at play to get us where we are today. As far as the timeline, it's a hard question because I feel like, and this is germane to what you said earlier about lifelong, right? So for me, timeline, it's like I'm still somewhere in that timeline right now. You know, I don't believe that it's over for me. I would say a big pivotal point for me was when I was in my doctoral program, working on my psychology degree. That was a point in time that really shifted a whole lot of how I thought and what my aspirations were and that sort of thing.
I ask that because I have run into so many people that set unrealistic timelines for
Mm.
their recovery from whatever it is that they are battling. And that's one of the challenges that I have with people is they feel that there's a certain identity that they should have, but they haven't met that yet. So the reality is not meeting their expectations. And it's like what Tony Robbins said, that leads to depression, it leads to anxiety.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so I was just wondering how that applies in your life with what you're doing.
Well, one of the things that it makes me think, and I apologize that this is going to be an indirect answer, but um, when I set out, my goal was just to not be a statistic. So you can hear how vague and undefined that is, right? And in some ways, if we're not being flexible and dynamic and rethinking that, we can get ourselves in trouble. And that's something that I've learned in, I would say, the last 10 years of my life. And what I learned specifically is when you set out to climb a mountain, you're supposed to reach the summit at some point. And those of us who are, you know, resilient and gritty and defy the odds and that sort of thing, we get so used to the climb or the hustle that it becomes a way of life and it becomes an identity. And we forget that we're supposed to crest that summit and that rest is actually supposed to be part of the goal. One of the ways that I've described that recently in life is when I was in state custody, so I was about 15, 16 years old, these kids at school wanted me to read this book by Stephen King called The Long Walk. And I wasn't all that interested. And, you know, my understanding of Stephen King was that he was kind of spooky and all this stuff. So not super interested. They wore me down, talked me into reading it. I read it. And I'm going to give some spoilers, by the way. So, what it reminds me of now is basically the Hunger Games before the Hunger Games happened. So the premise is that these boys, I think it's like 100 boys, have to participate in this walk, and it's an all or nothing thing, just like Hunger Games. The victor wins, and they win everything that their heart could desire. Everyone else gets killed along the way. based on the different rules and parameters and stuff. So they don't really get to sleep. They don't get to break, So you can imagine that this is an a non-human exercise and something that we're not that well equipped to do. So here's the spoiler. The guy who ultimately wins, by the time he actually is the winner, he doesn't know he's won because he's lost his mind. So when he can finally stop, he doesn't stop. He keeps walking and ultimately picks up the pace and starts running. So now he's supposed to be free and able to rest and that sort of thing. And he's gone mad in the process. That's the thing that I've learned, I would say, in the last decade of my life is that if we get too married to the self concept of resilience and grit, we can do the same thing as that guy and not ever see that we get to rest and that self-care is a vital part of the whole recipe.
I have not read that book, but now I want to read that book. And that ties into something that I really want to discuss with you, which is this journey that successful people go on. In my life, I have not yet met a person who is wildly successful that didn't come from adversity.
Mhm.
And most of the people that I know that are truly successful um, kind of became that way by running away from their past
Mhm.
more than it was running towards their future or their becoming.
Mhm.
It was, and myself included, an escape from all of the labels that had been placed on me in childhood
Yeah.
and realizing that I'm not any of those. I'm not the things society wants to define me as, and I have the ability to define my own life. You, in your role, when you're dealing with highly successful people, whether you're talking about military or professionals, is that something that you encounter often, where we don't know when to stop, when we've crested the mountain? Um,
Yes.
you
Yes.
crest the mountain and you're looking at the next mountain over there.
Yes.
Okay, I can go further.
Yeah.
What's your experience with that?
Well, and if you think about it, it works on a basic like reward punishment paradigm, So what you just said, people coming from adversity and becoming successful. So they're grinding and they're hustling and they're climbing, and there is a reward for that. And so it basically trains us to keep seeking the next reward because the alternative in our life experience is adversity. So do you see how the mind tricks us into thinking we either choose adversity or the reward of the grind and the climb? And so it's an intoxicating thing that we keep pursuing. And that doesn't mean we need to lay down and hang out on the porch or whatever and not move anymore. It means that we need to be more mindful and thoughtful about why and how and what is or isn't helpful to us. So absolutely, I see this all the time. And interestingly, you said military or otherwise. You probably know that I specialize in treating the military connected population because I'm a veteran. Most of those folks, go on to retire and become highly successful. And so they're kind of one in the same in the population that I serve. And it's not unrelated to the premise of what we're talking about, because if you look at research, the majority of people who enlist in the military come from adverse backgrounds. And so it's often an opportunity to not become a statistic. It's a way to create a life when we didn't have another way. And so we disproportionately see these folks in military circles. And then we see them do things that are wildly beyond, what statistics would predict.
This may be an off the wall question, but did you see yourself succeeding before you began this journey? Or was it something that you had mentors or something that influenced you along the way as you were going?
Well, I saw myself as succeeding at the beginning. Now that was a very rough depiction. If you picture like just the outlines in a coloring book versus like 3D Technicolor television, So my original vision was those cartoon outlines. I didn't know exactly what it was going to look like or where it was going to lead, but I believed in my capabilities. It was just trying to, overcome the walls to get there. In terms of mentors, I have to admit, I was kind of lost, kind of floundering, kind of confused. I didn't know who to ask for guidance. And a lot of times I was uncomfortable asking for guidance because where I come from, you're not supposed to come up on other people. You're supposed to carry your own weight. And also, I came up in a place in a situation where people who were successful didn't talk to me unless they were getting paid for it. And
Mhm.
so there was this disconnect between me and potential mentorship. I would say where I got the most impactful mentorship was a clerkship I was doing in the community while I was in grad school. So we start out practicing in the department clinic. And then as of year 3, we had to also work at a clinic out in the community, so that we could get diversity of ideas and ways of doing things. So I ended up applying for and getting offered a clerkship with a couple who were both psychologists, Fred and Carolyn Wolverton. Fred is intimidating, and I love the quote about is he intimidating or are you intimidated? I was intimidated, just so you know. Um, I was intimidated by him. He's not a small presence in a room, and he doesn't pull punches or apologize for his words or his the space he takes up, which is something quite admirable in retrospect. But at the time, it was unnerving. Carolyn had a very different posture. I described the two of them stylistically as there are two ways to carve a canyon. There's a hammer and there's water. So Fred was hammer, Carolyn was water. They were both incredibly impactful, and I could tell you a ton of stories. But germane to your question, I was sitting with Carolyn one day in supervision. I'm telling her about my patients, my cases, as I normally do. And at some point, she says to me, "You can't mother all your patients." And I like held my breath for a second. And I felt myself being a little offended. Like, I've gone through all this education and training and practice and all this stuff. And you think I'm just mothering. And you can imagine, like, having mothered my 3 brothers and all of that stuff, like
Mhm.
that hits in a personal place, right? And so I felt like it was degrading my knowledge and my skill set. And as I'm sitting there reeling from what she said and trying to take it in, she then quietly says to me, "Who's mothering you?"
Mhm.
And you can imagine there was no air left in the room after she said that. And that has hung with me in all the years since. It's been 15 or 20 years ago that she said that to me. And I remember driving home in this sort of existential crisis and realizing that I had never been mothered in my life. And what I was doing was giving what I wanted to other people. And that's what she was picking up on. But her way in saying it made it digestible to me and made it so that I could really reflect on it. And I would say that that is a mentoring moment that completely shifted my journey and what I was thinking about myself and where I wanted to go.
And I'm very intrigued on this one, and I would like to explore it a little bit more if you don't mind, because
Absolutely.
um, while in service for me, I spent 21 years as a military policeman in the Army, and I used to really boast about um, being a military policeman or being a sexual assault victim advocate or a suicide interventionist or a community resiliency or master resiliency trainer and all of these various things. And at some point I used to say, I became the change that I needed. And
Mhm.
I realized that in all of those roles that I played, I literally was just seeking somebody or seeking someone to see that I needed those things still.
Mhm. Yes.
I still needed them. So I would like you to explore that a little bit more. What revelations did you have as far as who's mothering you?
Well, I mean, the first and most lowbrow realization was no one, right? But it made me understand myself in a much deeper way. It made me understand not only the roles I was choosing, the hold on for this, the profession that I chose, and how I showed up in every corner of my life. It influenced all those things. But I also realized at that time, and because of that interaction, that my sense of self worth was entirely constructed based on what I could offer other people. It was what I could do for them. It was how I could mother or nurture them or cheer them on or believe in them more than they believed in themselves. And so I came to understand that my self worth was actually a facade, that my self worth was actually completely contingent on productivity and producing. And what I started thinking about after that was, okay, if I think about the worth of people that are closest to me and what I value in them and what makes them worthwhile to me, is it something they can do for me, or is it who they are and their existence? So in thinking that through, I ended up coming up with the analogy of, okay, if I was in a catastrophic car accident tomorrow, rendered quadriplegic, could not produce any of the things that I'm used to producing, could not give in the ways that I'm used to giving, what's left of me and how I see myself? And will I value myself in that state? Do I see myself as worthwhile? So a lot of people that come from places that we come from and survive and overcome the way that we do would see that as a nightmare. I mean, nobody wants to be quadriplegic, but the question of self-worth in that scenario, I think, starts to feel suffocating and damning to folks from backgrounds like ours. Whereas I again looked at the people around me and thought, if they were in a catastrophic car accident tomorrow and rendered quadriplegic, would I see them as any less worthwhile? And obviously the answer is no. And wouldn't I just be over the moon grateful that they survived? Absolutely. So then you can see the disconnect in my self view versus how I viewed others, right? And it had everything to do with that sense of worth.
Have you found what you were looking for?
I'm still working on it. In this current chapter, what I'm focused on is true freedom, which I think a lot of people may sound strange. I mean, from the perspective of, you look at my resume, you look at me, you know, it looks like I get all the choices I want in the world, right? And you know, we live in the United States of America. We took an oath, you know, to protect our freedoms and that sort of thing. But what I've realized in recent stages of life is that there are invisible chains in generational trauma. So there are the visible ones, the ones that we say, I'm going to break the chains, right? I'm not going to physically abuse people around me. I'm not going to be an addict. I'm not, you know, these really observable, concrete things. But then there are the invisible chains. And that's, am I comfortable sitting with my emotions? Did I ever learn how to do that? Do I know how to ask for help if I need help? Do I know how to share my vulnerabilities with other people? And am I willing to do that? Can I make myself available as more than just a producer, but a fallible human being who has fears and flaws just like everybody else? Have I learned that I can trust myself to keep myself safe? Or am I still waiting for abusers to grant me safety or grant me mercy? So those are the things that I feel like I'm focused on today, is a true sense of freedom from those invisible things that are less often named in generational trauma.
I appreciate your vulnerability and sharing that. I have this theory, or this, as I stand on stages, I tell people that you don't have to die to go to hell. I believe that hell is the inability to look in the mirror and appreciate the beauty of who you are for whatever reason, especially if you believe in a maker or a creator or the universe. And I find that so many people exist in hell. They're beating themselves up based on their past and how they view themselves. And for years, I was that same person, you know. And so everything that you've shared thus far, you and I are in great relation. Um, and I appreciate it. Is that something that you find amongst successful people? That, for instance, I'll give an example. I used to say that I was great at seeing clarity in chaos.
Mhm.
It was like a marker of pride to me that when everything is going wrong for everyone else, like I'm the guy in the middle of the hurricane directing traffic.
Yep. Yep.
And what I found is that as I held on to that as an identity, or as one of my greatest markers of success or self-worth, that life just kept bringing me more chaos
Mm-hmm.
to prove the point. And at some point I had to let go of that in order to stop the spiraling. Is that something that you encounter amongst other professionals, or even amongst yourself or within yourself? This latching onto a specific element of an identity that is actually kind of destroying who you are at the same time, or eroding who you are.
Yes, absolutely. You made me think of, I was watching a show one time and I can't even remember what it was. I should look it up someday because I reference this a lot, but it was some sort of boating, sailing documentary. It was a documentary about athletes, but this particular segment was on boating. And it was this grueling international waters event or something like that. But somewhere along the way, they were talking about the athletes who do this, and the person speaking said something to the effect of, you cannot be an elite athlete and be at peace with yourself. And
Mm,
that just hit. And
wow.
I feel like it so much has to do with what you're talking about right now. Whatever has worked for us historically, or what has made us feel like, okay, I can survive, we grab onto that with like a death grip. And so, like the thing you're talking about being able to direct traffic in a storm, that's a really common one. One of the ways that I came to name that in and of myself was I learned that I make people feel safe. So when
Mm,
there's a crisis, everyone turns toward me for signal of, do I need to panic right now? Oh no, you got this. Okay, I'll follow you, but who do I get to follow and who do you get to follow? And if we keep doing that, how many crises need us, right? Which is the chaos that you're talking about. We surround ourselves with whatever feeds that sense of identity. So if my sense of identity is that I produce for other people, I take care of other people, I nurture other people, then guess who I'm going to surround myself with? People who
yeah.
always need, and eventually the cup feels kind of empty, you know what I mean? And you're not learning how to step outside of your comfort zone. So in my case, stepping outside of my comfort zone would be, hey, I need help this time, right? But if you're surrounded by takers, and if you're surrounded by people who need something, you're not going to have anybody stand up and raise their hand when you say, hey, I want to practice needing something for myself.
Wow. That has been That's such a true statement for me. Find myself continually around people that can benefit from what it is that I'm offering. Even this thing called the sauce of life, where I'm hopefully helping people turn their tragedies into triumph. You know, hey, come here, let me show you how to turn your pain into purpose and things like that.
Mhm.
Honestly, it gets very draining
Mhm.
because it feels like I use the analogy of a cup of coffee.
Mhm.
And it's like you have this cup of coffee, and life brings you these experiences like shots of espresso, and they're just constantly refilling your cup of coffee. And that becomes identity at some point, what you're holding on to as your cup of coffee. But what I really truly want is that water,
Mhm.
because that water rehydrates me.
Mhm.
And it feels like a ginormous, overwhelming challenge nowadays to get someone to relinquish their cup of coffee, because that's what brings them comfort. That's what they know. That's what like they're sipping on. They really want the water, or they say they want the water, but they're holding on to their cup of coffee. And I wonder if that's something that's applicable to you, because what I came to realize just this week, I'm asking myself, what's in my cup of coffee? What coffee am I holding on to? And
Mhm.
is that particular thing, even in this sauce of life journey, is that my cup of coffee, where I want to be the embodiment of Stephen Covey's eighth habit, which is to find your voice and help others find theirs?
Mhm.
Have I reached that top of a mountain that I should be resting, and I don't realize that I've reached the top of the mountain yet.
Right, right. Well, and the hardest thing you can imagine is nobody can answer that but you, right? Which is a really annoying response, but I see that in myself as well. Like, nobody else is going to be able to tell me what's good for me and what's not good for me, what my summit is, what I'm doing for pathological reasons versus good reasons. And it is really hard to sort all that out because part of who I am, for example, is I want to leave things better than I found them. That's part of the idealist in me that I've learned to embrace. I want people to believe in themselves. I want people to know that they can overcome hard things, that they can do hard things. All of those things are important to me, and I don't want to relinquish that entirely, but I have to figure out how to do it in a way that is not harmful to me, that enriches my life rather than drains my life, or gives me the water instead of gives me the coffee, though I do like coffee a lot. I mean, you know, um, but, I've had to face the same thing with like being a psychologist. I described that moment, the who's mothering you moment. And I thought, of course I chose a helping profession. Of course I did. Here I am, but I'm this far in. Like, what do I do about it now? Um, so I've had to figure out a way that works for me and enriches me, and don't offer anything beyond that. And, I've learned, I joke that I like the taste of crow because I've learned to accept and embrace the idea of eating crow, because we should be learning and it should be dynamic. So if this works for me right now and this works for you right now, that's fine. But we also have the right to change our mind down the road if we decide that it doesn't work for us down the road. And I think those of us who are raised on trauma, we have a really hard time with the idea that we're allowed to change our minds. And for some reason, that tends to equate with failure if we change our minds.
That's interesting. I tend to run at failure
Mhm.
because I've found that everything that I've called a failure in my life has actually been an opportunity for me to learn from.
Mhm.
And I stand on that and I use it to grow and propel myself forward, or at least at the time what I'm thinking is propelling myself forward. But I'm wondering for others in professional realm, like, is that something where, because you can get stuck also. I've
Mhm.
seen people get stuck in this trauma loop, trying to
Mhm.
understand and process. And then there's others that just move forward. And even I say, just let it go like a kid on the monkey bar to be able to progress forward and move forward. But again, comes that question of, is that something where us high performers are so fixated on improving the world, leaving it better than we found it, leaving a legacy, generational wealth, however we want to phrase it, that we're running away from the past? Is it more of we're running away from the past, or is we running towards the future? I know I asked a version of that question earlier.
Mhm.
I'm very curious for you. Are you running towards who Joy Henry is supposed to be, or are you running away from that little girl
Mhm.
who had to endure all of everything that life put her through?
Right. Well, and it's interesting because I think it's both at the same time. Um, Definitely running away from the past because, and I think, most people like me don't want to be like that, whatever that is, right? I'm not going to do that when I grow up. My life's going to be different. There's something better that I'll be able to control or manage, in the future, and doggedly working toward that. As we're running from the past, aren't we creating our future? And aren't those indelibly linked in a way that you cannot pull apart? And so to me, those are one and the same, but we can decide to shift and go a slightly different direction. The other thing that I think about that I think is implicitly embedded in your question is, you know, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I'm thinking, who was I supposed to be? Right. Were it not for the trauma, who would I be? Were it not for the trauma, who would you be? And arguably, we'd be markedly different people. Honestly, that's a person I don't identify with in me because I don't know what that would have looked like. And I understand how, and I'm not saying I'm thankful for the trauma, but I understand how it has shaped me and how it's formed my personality and how I go about life and that sort of thing. So I think it's impossible to pull the past entirely out to create a future. So for me, it's about living well within the context of PTSD or complex PTSD versus trying to overcome it, right? And so being able to retain some sense of self and some of our values and integrity and all of that stuff while also counting ourselves in, because we don't have to just be vehicles for other people or for other ideals or whatever. We can also be vehicles to serve ourselves. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And that could be one of those slight adjustments in the arc that we're following over time.
Oh, that's beautiful. How do you address PTSD or complex PTSD? How do you make peace within yourself with those enemies that you're battling?
So I do want to say first that in my view, PTSD and CPTSD, complex PTSD, are two very different things. And, some people would disagree with me, but complex trauma is repeated chronic trauma, often occurring during important developmental years or sometimes later in life if it's of a coercive and chronic and inescapable nature. So we can think about domestic violence or being a POW or things like that as examples of later in life, which is very different than PTSD in the traditional sense, which is like a single event or maybe two-time event trauma. And I think that in psychology anyway, we do our profession a disservice and ultimately our patients a disservice by talking about them as if they're the same thing because they require different things. They do different things. So that said, the majority of the people that I treat have CPTSD. They're people who came from childhood adversity, whose understanding of themselves and of human beings and relationships were formed in the context of trauma. And so everything they experience thereafter does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs in that context of how they were formed and how they understood life, right? So if I'm treating CPTSD, I look at it like our stories are computer algorithms. And if you think about back in the day when we were first learning about what computers were and all of that stuff, we heard mention of zeros and ones, right? And computer algorithms and programming and all that stuff. Still a mystery to me. But I tell people that every single thing we've been through, everything we've experienced, everything we've learned or know or whatever is like a 0 and a 1. And so every single one of us invisibly is walking around with these complex codes of zeros and ones. So the first step is helping people understand what their code is and how they got to where they are now and why it makes perfect sense that they are where they are now. No matter how bleak it looks or how ugly or how miserable they are, like it needs to make sense in order for us to feel like we can get our hands around it and actually take action that's going to be meaningful and sustainable, which is then adding more zeros and ones to shift our outcome ultimately. So you can hear that's a different way of saying we have to understand our histories. We have to understand our motivations. We have to understand what has influenced us to understand what we're doing today and to have any influence over what we're doing tomorrow.
What would you say is the role of epigenetics in what it is that you just described? Where thinking about my life, I just use myself as an example. I'm a great guinea pig, but having been molested and raped so many times as a kid, a repeated trauma,
Mm-hmm.
I understood or I understand while I was in the military, when I would encounter someone who just had a single incident of a sexual assault, I approached it from a completely different perspective than they did
Mhm.
because of how many times I had endured. And so when you were talking about the difference between PTSD being a single event or maybe two events in alignment versus this is chronic, this is something that
Mhm.
continues to happen, over the course of years, especially in developmental years, um, and how it shapes the world view of things. I think about relationships that I have,
Mhm.
intimate relationships or intimate partner relationships, or even just professional relationships where I hold myself differently based on interactions that I learned from a kid or how I learned to navigate certain circles and feel a certain type of way.
Mhm.
So I'm very curious what role you feel epigenetics plays in that, because I can recall my mom and my grandmother saying things like, suck it up. It ain't going to kill you.
Mhm.
This person just did X, Y, or Z to you. You'll get over it.
Mhm.
Things like that. But then later in life, understanding that they also endured
Yes.
those traumas.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on that? Epigenetics.
Yeah. Well, so epigenetics specifically, and just for anybody listening, it's how gene expression is influenced by past generations and traumas and adversities that they've been through, and how those genetic properties are passed down to offspring and so on. So, like, one of the things that comes to mind, the first thing I ever heard of when I learned about epigenetics was back during the potato famine in Ireland, that chronic exposure to poverty and starvation and that sort of thing passed down genetic changes to the generations that came afterwards. And we are only just now learning about epigenetics as humankind. I think we're in our infancy of understanding about that, but in some it does create vulnerabilities to have these altered gene expressions that are consequences of generational trauma and chronic trauma. So I mean, an easy example would be research is increasingly finding that people who live with chronic PTSD or complex PTSD have far graver long term health outcomes. And some studies even show that they can statistically lose about 20 years of their normal lifespan because of the damage that it does to one's physiological system. So then if there are epigenetic changes from the people who came before us and we're getting that gene expression, then a couple of things happen. Number one, not only do we have those vulnerabilities, but number two, in the whole debate about nature versus nurture, most findings are that it's a combination of both. So we can think about somebody, for example, with a genetic propensity for schizophrenia. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to develop schizophrenia, but there is that proverbial switch there sitting in the off position. And more often than not, it's the environmental stuff that determines whether or not that switch gets turned on, right? So we don't know all of the epigenetic implications, but I do think that there's a pretty good probability based on what we know that we have some of those sitting in us that may or may not have been turned on based on what we've experienced. But this is part of the problem with ongoing intergenerational trauma is if it's a combination of nature and nurture, and the nurture part hasn't been fully taken care of by the time we're coming up in our childhood, then it makes it more likely that those switches are going to be turned on.
Okay. One of and thank you for that. One of my favorite quotes ever is from Dr. Wayne Dyer, who said that it's never the snake bite that kills you, it's the venom left coursing your veins.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I find that I know that I have battled with cortisol
Mm-hmm.
regulation, and so many other trauma informed or trauma experienced people from early childhood have issues regulating cortisol.
Mm-hmm.
What is your take on that, and how, as it relates to that quote, that it's never the snake bite that kills you, but the venom left coursing through your veins? Is there an anti venom, or is there a way to suck the venom out? Two different methods,
Mhm.
but
So I don't know. But here are my thoughts on it. And I say it like that because, again, we're just barely starting to talk about complex PTSD as a profession. It has not yet made it into the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It is an ICD code right now. So, and then there are practice guidelines from the APA on how to treat it. But there's still disagreement in our profession about whether or not chronic trauma or treatment refractory trauma is even a thing. You can imagine I'm of the school of thought that it is, you know. Um, so that said, um, I said earlier that I want to create a life where I can live well within the context of PTSD. So what I'm saying is there's not a cure, right? I'm also saying that venom's still in me, but it's about mitigation strategies. So for me, it's about trying to keep that as calm and as quiet as possible, because maybe we can't make it go away, but we can stop flare ups from happening, right? However, we want to define flare ups. So if I continue to surround myself with takers, that I engage in a dynamic with them that it mimics the dynamic I had in my childhood or the role I had in my childhood, obviously I'm just letting the venom run like free reign through my body. So I have to get a grip on that and change that. I have to become my own expert of not only my emotions, but what makes me well and what makes me unwell. And you can imagine that's going to be individualized from one person to the next based on the nature of their particular trauma. But I don't do well with surprise parties. I do not need a surprise party. As long as I live, I'm good without it. Please don't, right? So I can know these things and make decisions to go, I don't need that adrenaline dump in my body. I just don't. And I think the more we understand, like you're saying, cortisol and how that works and what it does, as well as all the other physiological processes that happen, like the adrenaline dump and metabolizing the adrenaline, that sort of thing, the more educated we are to make decisions to try to calm our system down, right? So I read a study that showed that people who don't have chronic PTSD can metabolize adrenaline in, it was like 20 minutes to 2 hours or something. Whereas people with chronic PTSD, it takes them up to 60 hours to metabolize adrenaline, because the body is always trying to be as efficient as possible. So if it's used to having all these adrenaline dumps, it's going to hold on to it for a while because it's like, let me be efficient. We're going to need this again in a minute because this is happening all the time, right?
right.
But for people with chronic PTSD, I'll tell them, do you realize what that means is? If we're talking about somebody without chronic PTSD, they're up in the mountains having a picnic, a bear comes out of the woods, adrenaline dump, they flee. And then an hour later, they're sitting on patio furniture on a sidewalk, like in Uptown, talking about back when a bear came after them. People with chronic PTSD can't imagine that because they're still so dysregulated and have all this adrenaline in them. There's no having just a reasonable conversation with a person about what just happened. And then if we think about 60 hours, what does that do to sleep? What does it do to relationships? What does it do to a host of things? So if we understand all of that, we have to curate the landscape in our lives to make it so that our bodies can be calmer. And that has everything to do with what I said earlier about working to trust myself to keep myself safe. And I think that if we're going to live our best lives possible, we have to do that.
I agree. I just wonder if safety becomes a distorted concept,
Mhm.
because for me as a kid, um, safety was more about invisibility,
Mhm.
disappearing,
Mhm.
and not, they're like out of sight, out of mind
Mhm.
way. And that's not necessarily the healthiest thing, because as an adult, you need to feel, I believe everyone wants to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to become who it is that they feel that they're supposed to become. But if you're taking away an element of that, whether that's being seen or being heard or just refusing or accepting that you can't become who you want to become, then I feel like you're damaging yourself. You're continuing to traumatize yourself. Am I
Right.
wrong in that, or what do
No,
you?
you're absolutely right. And I think you make a good point because it highlights the importance of how we define or operationalize something like safety. So, what I didn't say is something like that. Like, if you felt safe as a child by being invisible, and so that makes you feel safe now, really what you're talking about is a trauma response. And is that true safety? If you're just always trying to survive or cope or manage threat, is that true safety? Or is safety I can relax and my muscles can relax and I can feel comfortable with who I am and I can trust myself to feel whatever I need to feel and I can show up authentically in relationships and be seen and be connected to other people and know that I can handle it if I'm not for someone or they're not for me. To me, true safety isn't about threat management explicitly, or at least not in that survival way. It's about being able to be at ease with ourselves, including all of our flaws, and at ease with our self confidence to manage what comes at us.
Thank you for that.
Mhm.
I honestly can tell you that you're going to impact people's lives just from this conversation. There are a few people that literally people on my team that edit these videos that I know are going to listen to this and they're going to pull some things away from it because of things that they have related to their life right now.
Mhm.
Um, and I see that we're at the 52-minute mark essentially, and I try to keep these at an hour or less. But I was just thinking here about something that you said earlier, and it relates to trauma and how you have this chronic thing that happened. And it's not about a specific like trauma as related to an adverse childhood experience necessarily, but just something simple as like debt management and
Mhm.
how I came to the realization that because my dad was absent, my dad was in prison, and my mom developed this mindset that turn the lights off,
Mhm.
right? Because she had a drawer, we call it the candle drawer,
Mhm.
from front to back, just stacked up with candles and lighters and matches. So she was never afraid of the electricity being turned off.
Mhm.
Therefore, it was kind of like electricity was a luxury most times. But
Mhm.
I mean, she kept the lights on for the most part. But if it came to, hey, I want to have some drinks or I want to throw a party, that party was going to happen versus I'm going to pay the electric bill because we have
Mhm.
candles. And I just wonder how many people you encounter, especially in professional realms, that have learned to, as they progress through life, have a candle drawer
Mhm.
as a coping mechanism versus developing the habits that would have them pay, or the systems and the habits that would have them pay the electricity bill on time.
Mhm.
Is that
Yeah.
something that's common for you?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the jury's still out on what the right way is. But my thought is that we could have both. Um, Granted, having the candle drawer is a trauma response, right? It's threat management, like we just talked about. So it's not necessarily the height of safety as we would want that to look. However, if feeling safe because we have those candles tucked away enables us to focus all of our faculties on doing and saving and setting up and developing habits, then is the candle drawer bad?
Mm.
Right? Maybe that's the thing that calms us down enough to do the things we need to do so that we're not actually reliant on the candle drawer. And optimally, what would happen is, 10 years down the road, you're going through some purging process, spring cleaning, whatever, and you stumble across the candle drawer and you're like, huh, I haven't used those in 15 years. That's crazy. Do I still need those? I think that would be the optimal outcome, but it's not necessarily bad to have the candle drawer. One of the things that I think is I've said so many times throughout my life as I was navigating hard things or facing that maybe I would fail at something or whatever, I thought, well, I know how to be poor. I'm good at that. I'm real good at it. So I'm not scared. And so that was my candle drawer, or one of my candle drawers. And I think both of us would agree that there are a whole lot of candle drawers, when you come from this kind of past.
Definitely.
So having that, even though that wasn't my goal to go back and be poor and show how skilled I am at it, or how smooth I can make it look or anything like that, having that as a backup made me feel more secure in what I was doing and more secure to press forward because I wasn't so scared of what was behind me.
That's beautiful. Is there something that you would like to discuss or something that you would like to say, a question that I didn't ask that you would prefer to answer before we wrap this up?
Um, I think two things come to mind. One, I'll say the shortest one first. Mindset. One of the things that we overlook a lot is the importance of what we call in psychology an internal locus of control versus an external locus of control. And internal locus of control is I can affect change on the world around me, on my life, on my future. I can do that. Whereas an external locus of control is why is this happening to me? Things happen to me rather than I happen to things, right? So I read it simply put once of the difference of why me versus what am I going to do about it? And what am I going to do about it is an internal locus of control. And we have far better outcomes if we think that way. If we think about how we can enact change and influence the direction our life goes, that can predict everything. The difference between those two ways of thinking. The other thing that I wanted to say is the thing that I think is so underestimated in being raised on trauma, being resilient, trying not to be a statistic, is the importance of relationships, the relationships that we're surrounded by and what that normalizes for us. So I read a study once that was talking about how the friends we hang around with actually influence really major decisions in life, to include getting divorced, whether or not we're going to go to the gym and work out. Like the people we surround ourselves with influence what we think we should do or what is natural or what is normal. So people who come from trauma tend to run in trauma circles. That's really normal. It's really typical. It's what we all do. And I think a lot of people, well, not just I think, a lot of people I've worked with who were raised on trauma feel like aliens in circles that aren't trauma circles. They don't feel like they fit and it makes them uncomfortable. So it's not inherently bad to be surrounded with other people who come from trauma. But we have to make sure that they're the kind of survivors, they're the kind of thrivers that we want to be, that we want to be influenced by, and that we want to shape our perceptions of threat and safety and so many other things. If we instead are surrounding ourselves with people who are unhealed, who are toxic, who are harmful, the ones who go on to be the abusers themselves, our life's going to be a lot harder because of that. And so I just think that people shouldn't underestimate the power of relationships in their life.
I agree with you 100% there, with both statements. The first one, when I stand on stages, I tell people that my life changed when I learned that life was happening for me and not to me.
Mm-hmm.
It was all happening for me to learn the lessons from. And in alignment with what you were saying, because of that, even today, when something traumatic happens, I'm searching for the lessons of why this happened and what am I supposed to learn from it and grow from it. And then it's that statement, birds of a feather flock together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I do find that there are people who have processed, just like you have, that have processed through their traumas and are able to now literally turn those into ingredients that they use to feed others. And those are the types of people that I like to hang around because I feel that we raise the vibration of the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And we can sit in rooms where people that have endured traumas, even lesser traumas, if there is such a thing as a lesser trauma, but people that have not endured as much as we have. And again, I'm comparing traumas and I'm trying not to, but we're able to offer guidance and help people navigate through a period of life or an event related to a period of life. But
Mhm. Mhm.
listen, we could go on and on and on. I love talking
Yes,
with you. But let me
absolutely.
ask you this. Where can people find you on social media, or where you want them to find you at?
So I don't have a big social media footprint, but I am on LinkedIn under Joy Henry PhD. I also have an Instagram called cptsd.soundbites with a Y, where I just put out little thoughts, nuggets for people to consider having to do with complex PTSD.
Okay. And Dr. Joy Henry, Air Force veteran, community impactor, world changer. If this were the only time that you and I spoke, or the only time that someone from my audience got to hear you speak, what would you want them to walk away with?
I would want them to walk away knowing that we cannot outrun our past, and we see all these little sound bites out there about you are not your past and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, in the case of, or fortunately as it were, in the case of complex PTSD, we are shaped by our past, but we can completely shift the way that we see that. That can actually be a beautiful thing, and we can change the world because of it. And even if that's only our 3 feet of influence that we have, we can change that in a way that leaves a legacy long after we're gone.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
I appreciate you, and
Absolutely.
hopefully I can have you on again because
I'd be happy to.
yeah, yeah, you're very insightful. That will end this recording. I appreciate you.